Supporting English learners in reading complex text before, during, and after reading. This is part 2, and we will be focused on the during reading part. This is a presentation of California Reading and Literacy Project, the Fresno region, and it will be led by me, Jean Kofelt-Berletic. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a CRLP teacher leader, and I'm a 5th grade teacher. I have a passion for literacy, language, teaching, and learning. And I've been working with CRLP since about 20 years ago, and this is my 21st year teaching, so most of my teaching career. And I'm really excited to be able to share with you today a little bit more about close reading and how I use what we learn about in Rally, one of our programs, and how I use it in my classroom. And Rally is Results Academic Language and Literacy Instruction, and I use it with the curriculum that we use currently, and it works great. And fortunately, our curriculum is set up to go along with that too. So we'll talk a little bit about before, during, and after reading, what scaffolding means for in the ELA ELD framework, and then I'll give you some examples of what it looks like in complex text that my students are working with in 5th grade. So our outcomes for today are to continue to deepen our understanding of what close reading is and what a powerful tool it can be for student learning. Also to explore some of the scaffolding considerations for close reading, especially when we're reading with different purposes. And like I said before, I'll share with you some real classroom examples that we can examine that will show how we can support students' comprehension during reading. So to begin with, we're gonna, I'm not sure how many of you were with us last week, we're gonna take a really quick look at what scaffolding looks like in the ELA ELD framework. This quote is from the framework. Scaffolding does not change the intellectual challenge of the task, but instead allows learners to successfully participate in or complete a task in order to build the knowledge and skills to be able to perform similar tasks independently in the future. So we'll talk about how repeated reading really does that. It builds them towards success and independence. Last week also we talked about 2 types of scaffolding, and I will be referring back to these as we're working today. The first type is planned scaffolding. So this is the behind the scenes heavy lifting that the teacher does ahead of presentation to students. So it's the preparation that we do in advance of teaching in order to promote access to academic and linguistic development. And it really enables that just-in-time scaffolding that occurs during instruction, which flexibly attends to students' needs. And that just-in-time scaffolding occurs when we employ just in the moment formative assessment, which are part of the planned scaffolding. So I plan in opportunities for that. And then closely observe students' responses to the instruction and opportunities to demonstrate their understanding, and then provide the support as needed. So we plan ahead and we have it in our pocket for when it becomes necessary during reading. So some examples of what scaffolding, planned scaffolds might look like and just-in-time scaffolding might look like. Planned scaffolding includes connecting to or building prior knowledge or background for students, sequencing tasks from more simple to more complex, modeling, explaining, and providing guided practice, planning frequent checks for understanding, collaborative work, so students working with partners, working in small groups, and visual information, language models, both oral and written. And just-in-time scaffolding could be something like prompting for elaboration or clarification when you ask a question and a student doesn't quite get there, asking the question again in a different way. Targeted paraphrasing is when you restate the student's response and maybe modeling a correct grammatical structure, and then adjusting based on those frequent checks of understanding. So, okay, I'm making a decision. We do need to go back and reread this section, or no, we're ready to go on. And also previewing and making connections to prior knowledge. And that goes right back to the beginning of the plan scaffold. So while you're doing the reading, connecting back to what students talked about in that prior knowledge, and also giving them some foreshadowing for what's to come. So I'll show you a few examples of these in practice. In close reading, and close reading in the framework is defined as a tool that enables students to thoughtfully and critically read and analyze text. And students who meet these standards readily undertake the close, attentive reading that is at the heart of understanding and enjoying complex works of literature. We're not skipping any of the difficult stuff, but we're giving them the scaffolds they need to get through it and actually enjoy it. So last week we talked about how do you choose a text to close read, and we talked about selecting high quality text that's worthy of reading and rereading. It has to be meaty and have a lot of meaning and to get a lot of mileage out of it. And students must read the text, and teachers must analyze the text and determine why it might be difficult. And there comes the careful planning part. So we carefully plan instructions so that students can focus strategically on interpreting implicit and explicit meaning in the text. And this cover here is an example of a piece of text that my students are currently working with. And it's a biography of Jackie Robinson. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a second. So last week we talked about some of the things you would do before reading, like activate and access, as well as assess the student's background knowledge, and sometimes build it. And this first example, one of the things that we did was a gallery walk of historic images of sports in American culture. And so students got an opportunity to walk around and look at some different images and think about how long sports have been making a big impact on American culture. And that really started them thinking. And then they had the opportunity to read some quotes, and they did a tea party. So in this case, they had different quotes, and they walked around and talked about the different quotes with different students. And they had to talk about what that means about sports in America and in American culture. They had to make some inferences about what the quoted person meant and how they felt about sports. And then another thing we did before we read Promises to Keep was work on some vocabulary. These are some examples of vocabulary that came up in the quotes. And also there was one other piece we did, which was an analysis of an opinion article called It's Not Just a Game. And in that article, they had to determine what the author's opinion was about sports in America. But really what it was doing, all of these things were building their background knowledge and connecting to what they already know about sports in America. And they're pretty familiar with it, but then they built it into a historical context as well. And last week we also talked about another piece of before reading. And we're going over these pieces again because they connect right into the close reading. And they are to explain the receptive task. So why am I reading this? So are you reading to understand, make inferences, observations, etc.? And explain the expressive task. So for example, before they even got to Promises to Keep, when we started talking at the gallery walk, I told them that we were going to be where we were heading with all of this. So I told them that at the end of this unit, they will be writing a letter, and it's an opinion piece, to a book publisher making a recommendation for an athlete about whom they should write a biography. And so they knew where they were going. And in that, we also looked at previewing text for text features and text structures. So we had some guiding questions, really looking at sports and athletes and how they have an impact on culture and what the role of sports has been and is currently, and how athletes have broken barriers as they in the historical eras in which they lived. And also a focus on biographical information texts, because they started out with things that they were familiar with, quotes, very accessible, photographs, very accessible. Now we're into a different genre that they haven't worked with this year, and it's a biography. So we talked a lot about what are the features of biographies. And when we started, they said, well, I know it's about a person. So we looked at the language, what does it mean? And one of our standards focuses on the meanings of the Greek and Latin roots. And so we looked at how bio is life and graph is right. And so they came up with, it's a story or a text written about a person's life. And then as we proceeded through the book, we looked at what are the features that are in here that would be helpful or maybe tricky for us, and why would the author include those things? And some of the things we came up with were timelines, captions, pictures, and in this case, photos, because that gave them some clues about what the setting of the story. So when did this take place? Okay, I know in history we've been learning about when the beginnings of America. This has to be more recent than that because there are photographs. And we also talked about historic artifacts, which they were familiar with from social studies, but it was different for them to see it in the context of a biography. And thought about chronological order, because that really helped them understand that they weren't going to see ultimately why he was famous, but at the beginning, and that they would see that over time. So it kind of develops in the same way a narrative does sometimes. And so they would see towards the end of it, maybe more of his impact. So we did all of this before reading. And when I talk about the receptive task and expressive task here, these are broad ones related to an entire unit. When we look at the during reading part next, you'll see that there are actually there are purposes for reading that are within each of the chunks of reading that they do in close reading, as well as smaller expressive tasks that they're expected to do, and that are also, those are scaffolded as well as scaffolds. And then the previewing of the text and the text features. So if we look at the during reading part, some of the scaffolding routines that we use are two big sections: comprehension monitoring, as well as vocabulary step-asides. And the purpose of these scaffolds is to facilitate comprehension. And comprehension is a term. Comprehension monitoring is really a form of metacognition. So they're thinking about their thinking. And it's really whether you know or you know that you either understand or don't understand something. And these strategies are very flexible, and they are partially planned, and some of them are just in time. And here's where I'll build off of the setting the purpose for reading. This will be a different focus or purpose for each chunk of the reading that the students will be doing as they're going through this text. And the other one is more, where are we ultimately going with this? And the pieces of that are setting a purpose. So this is where you think about what types of questions you'll have, and the focus will change with a new purpose. So your type of question changes with your new type of your new focus or purpose for reading. And the purpose of the self-checking is, well, we start with self-checking where the teacher plans in and asks the questions and does a lot of thinking aloud. But some of the supports that we use for those are thinking maps, just statements, and students may pair share at this time or do a retelling, either written or oral, and either write or talk about a summary, so summarizing chunks. And those are those opportunities for teachers to catch where things are not going right, and opportunities for students, excuse me, to employ fix-up strategies. So of course, until they're doing those things automatically, the teacher models or cues them in different ways to reread or read ahead or deconstruct sentences that might be particularly tricky. And they might also result to talk to a peer about it, or even the teacher, which is of course what we want them to do as a last resort, but we don't want them stuck forever. The other part of planning the scaffolds for during reading is the vocabulary part. So we did a little bit of vocabulary work up front for vocabulary words which are not easily figured out by context, and also not easy to explain, like one word to explain it or relate it to another word. So the words that I showed you from the before reading section, these will be words that they might encounter during reading that might trip them up a little bit, but they're not necessarily words they will have to produce when they're explaining their understanding. It's also so this is an opportunity to explain and define some tier 1 and tier 2 words, and also do some instruction and support with cognates if you have students that are English learners, and to focus on the signal words that relate back to the type of text that the students are reading. For example, this one, because it's told over time, you have a lot of words that they might see in a narrative that show how time has passed. And now when we're thinking about the scaffolds too, the next part is really thinking about what types of reading are we doing? This is not work that we're doing for something that we're reading one time, but something, like I said, that we can go back and read and reread and reread. Now this rereading is different. The purpose for this rereading isn't a fix-up strategy, but it's a strategy for the teacher. It's a strategic way to come back to the text to get at learning a skill or learning a concept. So the first reading, and these are planned to develop their fluency with the reading, their familiarity with the content, and they should be sequenced thoughtfully so that they build in sophistication and complexity and or focus. So as they become more comfortable and confident with the vocabulary and the content of it, they can get to a deeper meaning. Where the first reading, they're most likely determining what the text says and what it means. During a reading like that, students might stop and do a gist. Oftentimes, like with this particular text, we would do a preview of part of it, and then I would assign a page or two for the students to read at home for homework, and they would write a gist for the sections that they read, and then we would debrief those gists before we reread it together for another purpose. And following the gist reading or finding out what it says or what it means, and during a second reading, they could be working on figuring out how the text worked. So how did it flow, and why did the author write it this way? Why do you think the author would use these pieces? An example is the timeline portion of the book. My students did a gist of the timeline, and I'll show you an example of what they wrote. And then afterwards, we talked about, well, why would the author include a timeline that was before Jackie Robinson's life if this is a biography about him? And that really helps us get to the third reading, which is determining the text's deeper meaning, as well as its relationship to other texts, experience of the reader, or the broader world. And so the students were able to, with this development of readings and complexity, to get from, oh, it says this on this day, but it really builds to say, oh, I think the author wanted to include this so that we could see the history of slavery in America. so that they could explain what life was like and how things had developed in America over time before Jackie Robinson's time. So some of the considerations for close reading, facilitate, and we'll think of it as facilitate, our role here is facilitate comprehension. And so chunking text in logical and meaningful sections is key to this, because it's easy if you plan to read an entire text that's long and very dense for the kids to get lost in, you defining words and trying to explain things. But if we look for chunks that are logical and meaningful, they plan and build right into the next step. And with that, we plan the questions with those that also promote independence with comprehension monitoring. So the teacher will begin with a lot of support or prompting with summarizing and paraphrasing and retelling. And a step aside here is I've been working on that all year. And today during testing, some of my students were finished and they were reading some other articles. And they were actually using the close reading annotation marks that we use, and they were writing gists, and it was just like a fun article. So it does and that's what our goal is, that they get to independence with use of those, so that they really understand that the purpose for reading this is to understand it. The other part that we like to plan ahead is the vocabulary step-asides, which is contextualized vocabulary instruction. And the reason you want to plan that ahead is it's really difficult sometimes to just on the fly come up with a definition for, say, segregation, or an example of something of barriers, or some words are difficult to come up with. And what you might find is you might plan 15 words in a section of text that you have definitions for, but your students may already have a good understanding of 5 of those and you don't even use it. But the planning part's important so that you're ready when the scaffold is necessary. So those step-asides are both. They could be, they are planned, but they also are those just-in-time ones. So when you see that students are having difficulty, then you would spend some time on the words. So the planning part is what is at the heart of this. Like I mentioned last week, really you have to read so carefully what it is your students will be reading so you know it inside and out. And we're going to think about what it looks like and what it means to create text-dependent questions that support your students' comprehension. So some of the steps for developing questions, you want to identify the core understandings and key ideas of the text. So what is at the heart of this text and why am I having my students read it? What should they get out of it? And then start small to build confidence. So for example, with this book, we started by just looking at the cover. What are we looking at? What do we see on the cover? What questions do I have and what inferences can I make? And so you build confidence over time. You want to target vocabulary and text structure because those are things that they need instruction in. And here you have a great context to teach it. You want to tackle tough sections of the text head on. I know in the past, oftentimes, people would skip sections if they were too hard, or even simply just paraphrase it or tell their kids, oh, it says this, it means that. But really going through it and struggling with it head on. And with that, creating coherent sequences of text-dependent questions. So they build on one another and they build to the next section. And most importantly, I think maybe for most of us, is identify the standards that are being addressed. So and I kind of think of that with number 1. So what does this text offer? And what can my students learn through this that are their standards? And then to also create a culminating assessment. So if they got it, what did they get? And how will I know? So I'm going to show you a few examples as we get ready to wrap up tonight of what this looks like in my classroom. So some of the considerations I mentioned were chunking, and I'm going to give you 3 little examples. As we got into this book, we started with the cover, and we started with, what do you notice, what do you wonder, and what are your inferences? And the students have did this in their notebooks, but I also created an anchor chart of their ideas. And I started with my notebook, so I'll show you if this is what it looked like. They noticed in the pictures that because there's a back cover too, it was a family and it looked like he was on a farm. And someone noticed that the author's last name was Robinson. There was an old car, black and white photos, and in the inside cover, under the dust cover, there are pictures of him playing baseball. So they wondered who the children were. They wondered how he played. They wondered if the author was related, and they wondered what he was pointing at or what was the significance of him pointing, and they wondered where they were. And they made a few inferences. They inferred from the black and white photos that he lived in, and the old car that he lived in the past, but not the long ago past, that he was a baseball player, a father. Because he was in the book was about him, they also made an inference that he was famous and that the author was his relative, and a few of them had peeked ahead, so they knew it was actually written by his daughter. Next, we looked at Jackie Robinson's life. So we looked at a section about slavery in America. And this timeline went from 1619 to 1870 and looked at slavery in America. And the students made a few, they have already studied that in social studies, but what they made a few summary or gist statements about that to really set in their mind, okay, this was where he's coming from. The next section was called A Black and White World. Segregation was part of American life. And they hadn't really talked about segregation before. So this was a response that the students did independently at home, and then they brought into class. So the question went with a section, just 2 pages of the text, and they were to respond, in what ways were segregation laws used to control Black people? And so they brought these in, and then we did an activity where they got to share them out. So these were ways that we chunk the understanding and build toward the next step. And so I would say now you're ready to question. Last week we were ready to read, and this week we're ready to question. Next week when we come together, we'll talk about that culminating assessment. So how will you know when they know it, and how will you support them so that they can truly demonstrate what they have gained in understanding and comprehension based on the reading of the text. So I hope you will join us, and I will have some more examples from my class about this book probably. And we'll look at, like I said, the after. How do we support students after reading? If you would like to find us, you can find us on Facebook at CRLP Fresno State, or on the web at crlpfresnostate.org. And thank you very much. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the question area in the chat, and I will take a look. And if you're departing, thank you for coming by, and hopefully we'll hear from you next week.